Alright friends, we are back for part 6. Now I would have loved to put this whole build into a lot less videos, but seriously, once it hits an hour and 20, maybe an hour and 30 minutes, it's like, hey, that's enough. The editing would take forever to go through. It's like, let's break this up into another part. So, the last time, I pretty much ended at the front window guides. Now, a few things have kind of happened since then. I was traveling a little bit more for my piano shows that I do, and being that I do drive quite a bit, my 428i was starting to get a little high in the mileage, and then of course that led me down the road. Well, do I get a newer car? What do I do? So after, years of kind of looking and following the company, and I feel like I knew what a Tesla was long before anyone had really seen them on the road. I'd, kind of seen the Roadster on the internet and did some research, but knew they were expensive. I finally got to buy my first Tesla, so I got a Model 3, and that led me down the rabbit hole of a few other things, like I had to take a week or so to move some things around in my garage so that I could install some 220 outlets, and that allows me to charge easier at home. Which then brought me into liquidating a bunch of clutter and junk in my garage and trying to get things a little bit more organized before I get back to the build. So that's where we're at now. I'm glad to be kind of back on this, and I'm going to kind of pick up where we left off, but we haven't talked too much about fitting the doors, even though at this point you had to have put your doors on to get your bolt holes. But now I'm going to talk a lot more about the latches and kind of getting the doors fitted, where you can open and close them just fine. And what we're trying to do by the end of this video at least is make it to where most of the car is built from the rear end up to where the front clip starts. And the only things that we might be leaving out is maybe the rocker panels or the running boards at the bottom, because I don't really want to try fitting those on until I've got the front clip where it goes. I feel like we're going to build back to front, including the roof wing and the trunk, but then we're going to come back to maybe do some of the smaller trim pieces and then those bottom boards, of course the front splitter. That way it's kind of going in the order that it needs to go. So here we go. We're going to kick off this part 6, and as always, I've got a lot of information to cover, so sit tight and grab some snacks. So I had to get the little door latch piece installed. I had to build a metal spacer to go between it. That's what the silver part is. And this has to go in the exact location, like up and down, left and right. I had to make the holes. And then it screws into this like plate on the back. I don't know if you can see it. Yeah, there it is. So it had to be like perfect, or else the door doesn't shut with proper alignment, and you have to like redo it. And I got it on the first try. Okay, I've got some clips on this part that I'm gonna share with you guys. Basically, in summary, when you're trying to get that latch in the right place, the easier way that you probably could do this is lock the latch into the door. So make sure you get both clicks. You're going to lock it into the door and then move the door to where you want it. And I think you can actually get, a little Sharpie marker from the inside. You want to get from the inside of your door jamb, you can pretty much draw some guidelines that I think will get you close. I didn't want to have nuts on the back of the plate, so you're going to go through the body, through the metal plate that you welded to the roll cage, and what I was hoping to do was get the hole so perfectly that I could drill it to the proper thread tap size and then tap the threads, because I used a piece of plate on the roll cage that's probably almost a 1/2 inch thick. So there's plenty of room for threads. That's what I was going for. Now, the passenger side, I succeeded. I got the latch exactly where I wanted it, and I was able to tap the threads out. Boom, the latch goes in one place, that's it, it's done. As far as the driver's side, I don't know, it might have been beginner's luck, because the driver's side I was off by about 1/8 or 1/4 of an inch. It just didn't look right. So I ended up drilling those holes out just a tad bit, and it's just enough to where I was able to put a locking nut on the back, and it's still no big deal, it's gonna work just fine. But in these little clips, you're gonna see I kind of went through the process how I got that first one to line up just right. And it was basically because I was able to use the fiberglass thickness of the body and that little bit of panel bond that filled the void between the metal plate behind it. So there was just enough there where I could thread a really small screw into it, and it held that latch temporarily for me just tight enough to where I could really lightly shut the door and know that it was in place or not. So I think I got it to a point where I was able to like slide the latch on those little screws a bit. I got it perfectly in place, and then I knew I had to adjust my holes over and up, I believe like 1/8 of an inch. But you know, this was one way that I did it. There's a few ways to get it right, I'm sure, but you just got to be really tedious about this part. It's definitely a tricky one, and there's not any play here. You want the door to shut exactly where it needs to go. You want it lined up with the body, you know, and that's given that your hinge is adjusted pretty correctly, you know, at least it's close and all that. So this is something that you definitely want to spend some time on and try to get it as correct as you can. So let's just say this part of the video would have been worth a lot of money to me if someone else had already done it. Because the way I did it was I took a piece of tape, which is right here. I put it right there. Now, I locked the latch into the door all the way where I knew that it was gonna set. Now the first thing I did was I closed the door as much as I could with a little bit of gap, just enough to get a skinny Sharpie marker through there. Now right on this edge is where the tape was rolled over, and I had the latch hovering right over it. So what I did was I took my marker and I made marks right at the center of the 2 bolt holes. The next thing that I did was I tried to hover the center of the bolt holes over this edge. Now what did that do for me? It gave me a reference point to measure. So if you can see, the bolts are about, well, these are just some screws, they're temporary. These are about 1 1/8 inches or so away from that edge. Okay, now the reason why is because once I had a measuring reference and I had some bolt centers, at least pretty close, I took the door and I put it here and I said, okay, as soon as those holes hover right over this edge, how far do I have to go before the door is closed? So the door was hovering about 1 1/8 inches out. I made that measurement, and then I came back over here where I had 2 bolt centers and I measured 1 1/8 inches in. So you may not even have to go through all that, because I mean, you probably should, because your car is going to be a little bit different from mine. But that's what I did. I tried to figure out what's the best way to get as close as I can without having to make these bolts adjustable on the back. Now, all in all, in the end, if I have to, I'll make the holes a little too big and use nuts on the back, the way that some of the cars are built. But what I'm trying to do is get it to where I can thread the bolts into the plate, the metal plate that's behind this jamb. I want to be able to thread those bolts in and hopefully not have to worry about ever adjusting that latch. So the apparatus that I have set up here, these are some kind of thick washers, because I did hear that you have to use a spacer. These washers probably give me, let's see, just go ahead and measure it real quick. Not a tape measure, a little cheapy one. So those give me somewhere around 1/4 of an inch, maybe a little bit more. So I'm gonna end up building a metal spacer plate that's a little bit, you know, whatever. I'm gonna get some metal that's a little bit more than 1/4 inch thick and basically make a spacer plate for this. The other thing that I did was those screws that you see are not the size of the hole. Let me show you what I've got here. So I'm gonna take one of them out. If you haven't gotten to the point of bonding or welding the plates on the roll cage yet for these plates, let me tell you something. If that plate is sitting flat against the fiberglass back there, okay, that's fine. But I think my plates are probably sitting maybe 1/8 of an inch or so. And what did that do for me? Well, that means that there's panel bond in there that's filling some of that void, and panel bond is pretty strong like the fiberglass. So what ended up working out is these screws that I just got to actually latch the door are just like some regular wood screws where I shaved the tip down. Okay, this washer is actually an aircraft countersinking washer. You can see that it has a little bit of a taper. Well, let's see if it'll focus. Having trouble getting it to focus. Okay, it's got a taper back there that allows the screw to sink into it a little bit. Now, you don't have to use that. That's just what I did to try and take up a little bit of that screw head, because you will have to grind that down some, or else the door's gonna rub against it. Everything is really, really close whenever you're doing this. So what I did was I ground the screw down to where when it goes through the plate and those two washers, it only had enough threads left to penetrate into the fiberglass and the panel bond, because if it hits my metal plate, it's not gonna tighten this thing down. And you can see I've gotten these screws to tighten it really good, just, you know, just enough to where I could test the door and see if it was gonna latch. And let me tell you, this is exactly where I need this thing to go. So hopefully that helps you guys. I wanted to take a video of this because I have scratched my head over and over and brainstormed on how I was gonna do this part and try to get this just right in the perfect location. And I think I've pulled it off. Like I said, worst case scenario, if the holes end up having to be just drilled a little bit oversized and then we use nuts on the back, it's not the end of the world, but I'm gonna try my best to see if I can get it to where the holes are in one spot and the door latches perfectly right in place. Alright, so here's where we're at with the door latch on the passenger side. So I started with my little mock-up situation here where basically I used two of these thick washers as spacers. These are the same washers that I bought at Lowe's for the door hinge as well. So the like Lambo door hinge worked really good. I wanted a good thick washer, you know, for the bolt to hold those things on. So what I did was I took the door latch piece itself, and pay attention to where it's worn from over the years, because that's how you're going to be able to, you know, tell which way that it goes. I like to keep things the same, even if it doesn't really matter. But so basically what I did was I took my little aircraft countersunk washer here, and I used like a wood screw, and I shaved down the tip so it didn't have the point. Now when I got really, really close with my estimate on where this thing was gonna go, I put it where it seemed like it was gonna go, and it was right there. So you can see my hole was a little off on the first try. Now remember, what you're doing with this little setup here is just enough to space the hinge and get it where it needs to go, and then the threads that come through are just enough to penetrate into the fiberglass and the panel bond that's between the fiberglass and the plate. There's a metal steel plate back there. So, you know, you might have an 1/8 inch of, just depending on how far off that you were. And again, if you know, if you're welding that plate back there and it doesn't sit perfectly against the body of the car when you weld it, it's not the end of the world, because if there's some panel bond in there, it's going to give you a little bit more grab for this little test fit. So this is kind of cool. So I had made the screw just long enough to where it would penetrate into the fiberglass and the panel bond, and I temporarily screwed that thing there. So once I got it as exact as I could, it ended up looking like this. Okay, the screw was in there, but it was a little down to the left, and I ended up drawing these markings because even though this plate was elevated, you know, the thickness of those two washers, I still looked from straight dead on to make that marking as accurate as I could, so that when I set this plate here, I was going to be able to draw out the holes to try and get them a little bit more centered. Now, all in all, if this doesn't work, I'm just going to have to bore out those holes and put a nut on the back of the bolt like a lot of the cars are built. But I'm trying my best to make it to where this latch goes in one place, and that's exactly where I want it, and the door shuts there every time. So basically, and you know, worst case, if I got to end up drilling them out, at least my hole started pretty centered. So once I got to this point, I was able to look in there and see that the holes made by these screws were a little bit down and to the left. They were down here, and you can kind of see the way that this is shaved out. Not that hole, that was the incorrect hole the first time when I had to move it a bit. But right here is where these holes were made, and as soon as I was able to set the latch plate on, I drew out those circles so that I could, you know, further center my holes a little bit more. Now, take this little bit on the Dremel and just cut out the fiberglass and the panel bond so that whenever you start to drill this, your drill bit can kind of self-center, which is what's about to happen in a minute. So basically, if I drill these holes and I get them nice and straight, I should be able to put this latch on with those holes threaded. The metal plate back there, you know, I'm going to stick a tap and die through it. It should be threaded and it should hold this plate exactly where it needs to go. And again, I'm just trying to get this right. If I don't like where the door sets when I get it on, well then I'm just gonna, you know, I mean, there's a few things that you could do. You can actually, you might have to use screws that aren't really countersink, but then again, that doesn't work. You just have to wallow the hole out because those screws have to be pretty flush or else the door is gonna rub. Even when I had, this is just kind of going off on a little side note, even when I had this screw, I had to grind them down, as you can tell, because the door is so close. This is such a close tolerance here that the screw was rubbing the door a bit. So that countersunk screw has to be in there. It's just that if you're gonna widen these holes out to get this to slide around a little bit, you're gonna have to find a way to do it with the countersunk too, so that, you know, and it might be kind of ugly, but I'll figure it out. Worst case scenario, I'll just, you know, like I said before, I'll just end up cutting the holes out a little bit bigger, and then there will be nuts on the back so that you're using a bolt and a nut with this instead of trying to go into a threaded plate. But we're kind of striving for perfection here if we can. So that's what I'm doing with this, and spend some time, because this is like, I don't know, this is pretty important. And if I can get this right, I'm going to feel really good about it. Alright, I don't really know if it's necessary to use the little center punch, but I'll do it anyway. I believe the holes needed to be about right there. And really it's going to drill centered anyway, because it's going into that fiberglass. It's going to help guide it. Alright, here we go. Let's hope this works. Now, as for permanent means of the spacing, I used my torch and cut out 2 of these plates, and I need to grind them and clean them up real nice. I'm gonna actually get them to where they look like the latch plate, but that's gonna be the spacer instead of those washers. And I was able to take the 2 washers together and see that this plate is pretty much the exact same thickness. It might be a little bit thinner, which I think is okay, because either way it's going to get some paint on it, and you know, it might, I think it can handle the latch being a little further that way, but you're talking you know, maybe a millimeter or something, if even that, some thousandths. So that's what I used, some 1/4 inch plate. There we go. One door is test fitted and latching. These are the Lambo style doors, so that thing makes it go up. But yep, it's pretty cool to get to that point. So at this point, I've got the passenger door latched for the first time. The gap looks pretty good around the bottom. I gotta go and do some fine tuning in certain areas, but what I did was started out with the door pretty far back, so I'm just gonna have to widen the gap a little bit in some places. Otherwise, not bad. Now, so far, the fitment is pretty dang straight. It's body workable, and in some cases, you know, I'm gonna probably run a little bit of filler, some glaze on either the door or the quarter to get them to match up real nice. but I feel like this is a really, really good starting point. So if you've been following this build for a while, you've kind of seen me messing with these rear trim parts here and there. And this is one of those things where it's really going to test how tedious that you can be with something. I mean, these parts have so many ways that they could either fit correctly or incorrectly. And it really comes down to not only getting them positioned as good as you can, but where you go back and add a little bit of, fiberglass or some putty here and there, where you maybe take a little bit off, getting it to where they don't rub against your brand new tail lights and things like that. It all matters. So these parts have been through quite a bit to get them to the point of being ready to paint. And I figured once they were ready, let's just go ahead and spray them. I don't want to paint too much before I get the main body done, because I don't want to have a bunch of nice painted parts just sitting around. But I figured these were a few of the parts that I could, just get them done, kind of see how they look. And before we know it, we'll be painting the whole body. So, anything after that can just bolt right back on. But these parts I figured to be harmless. Let's go ahead and spray them. Of course, I'm anxious to paint some stuff anyway, so you get to see that in this part. And once all the prep's done, they came out pretty nice, and I love being able to use the booth whenever I get a chance. Okay, so far the trunk lid has come out pretty nice. I got the slick sand sanded, which is the first round, and that's a polyester primer. I know I've talked about it a little bit. It's made by Evercoat. It seems to be pretty good stuff, and it's only about $200 for the gallon with the hardener. Now, that being said, it builds super thick, so $200 basically primed the whole main body of the car. Okay, and now I'm on the second gallon. So the second gallon primed the roof wing and that trunk lid and those other two little pieces, but I've only used 2 quarts of it. So right now I'm about $300 into primer, and I've got trunk lid, those little trim pieces in the back. Oh, I also did, with the first gallon, I did the rear diffuser, so it's doing a little bit more. So the main body, all that stuff, I've spent $400 on primer, but I've still got 2 quarts left. So basically, I'm $300 in what's been used. Now, when you think about it, it doesn't go a long way because you're hosing it on really thick with a 2.5 millimeter tip. And that's good because it's working kind of like spray Bondo. I love the stuff, but like they say, you're gonna probably end up needing about 4 gallons total. The slick sand is a polyester primer, and it seems to stick really good to the white gel coat when you sand with 80 grit. So what I'm gonna do now is I'm gonna go back. I've already sanded these parts. I've done some spot putty work to touch up some of the little imperfection areas and then places where I had to add fiberglass. Remember, these edges, you want to work all this stuff really nice. I actually have put these on the car quite a bit of times to make sure that it follows. And we're going to put on the next round of primer. But what I'm using is not going to be the slick sand because I don't need such a high build this time. What I'm going to do is use a 2K. And a lot of you, if you've done paint and body work, you've probably seen the Finish 1 stuff. It's not bad. It sands a little bit. If you're sanding with something higher than 220, it's a little tricky because it does clog up the sandpaper quite a bit, but it's a very solid primer to me so far, and it is fairly cheap. I don't think I'm gonna put this as my final primer on the main body because I'm a little bit tough with trusting cheaper paint materials on cars. But when it comes to some of the small parts, I know that worst case, if it ever failed, I could take the trunk lid off and I could reprime, whatever. If I don't wanna have to repaint it, but I would rather it be something like a small part and say, oh, the cheap primer failed, than something like the main body out there. And I'm thinking I'm probably gonna get some PPG K36 or maybe the NCP 271. which I'm very familiar with those primers. The 271 is actually a lot like the Finish one. It's just the higher quality, it's more expensive. You know, those gallons, you're typically gonna spend around 400 for a gallon, where I think this was under 200 with the hardener. So I'm just a little funny about cheap paint materials. I don't like using them, especially on something that I'm gonna keep and, you know, that I really like. I've used cheap clear coat in the past and it literally peels off after a year and a half in the sun. But for me, it's all about the premium clears. I use Sherwin-Williams CC950. This is a quicker one, the 931. And, you know, 950, I want to say you're typically somewhere around 400 for a gallon. And the hardeners, you got 904 and UH80 I use for some of the other clear coats. But this stuff I want to say is probably over 100. You might be close to 600 bucks for a gallon with hardener. But it's meant to last. It's premium, just like what comes on your car from the factory. Your factory paint job is always pretty high quality. That's why your car lasts for, you know, 10 or 12, 15 years in the sun. Before it starts getting sun-baked. And you know, when you go to a body shop, you have collision repair done. If you got into an accident, usually they're using some of that cheap stuff, and it's gonna probably come off within a year or two. So I'm not a big fan of cheap paint materials, but so far the Finish One primer has been pretty good to me, and I'm willing to try it on some of the smaller parts for the Vaydor. Now I felt like I went over and over and over these parts, sanding them, filling them with putty, even little bubbles and voids in the fiberglass. You know, you might sand certain areas and then you realize there's a soft spot. So you know, test it with a little pick or the screwdriver and you punch through and you end up finding a dime size, you know, bubble under the first layer of fiberglass or something. So these pieces did take a little bit, definitely some patience, because I think it's a matter of perception. You know, you feel like, oh, they're small parts, they should go fast, they should be easy. Well, you still have to go over every little square inch and make sure that you're not going to have something that shows through the paint later and makes you have to take it apart and, you know, and respray. So yeah, it's definitely a lot of spot putty. I used the resin putty when I was touching up kind of a good sized bubble. But, you know, for little pinholes and things, you'll see the red spot putty. And once these things had been primed, you know, 2 or 3 times, I felt like they were ready to go. And they came out pretty nice. So some years back, I bought almost a gallon of Synergy Green. I loved that color on the Camaros, and I thought it was the perfect mix of like a bright green with, of course, metallic in it. It had to be a nice metallic, and kind of a bright green without looking too washed out. And I feel like even now, I've seen people use it on certain vehicles where it just doesn't look right, or maybe they don't use the proper white sealer under it like you're supposed to do. In some cases it looks a little dark, so I was a little hesitant on whether or not I was going to use this color. But I had bought it for a BMW that I was going to paint, and I ended up selling that car. So I felt like, you know, I wanted my Vaydor to end up having a primary color of a bright green. So I already had the paint, and that's great. So I said, let's test this out. The trunk lid was probably one of the pieces I figured could be first, because I'm pretty sure it's going to go green in my paint scheme. And it was close enough to get it ready, and figured, hey, why not? Let's prep it out and get some color on it and see how this thing looks, and we'll go from there. Now, I'd say overall, I think this is a pretty cool color. To some degree, I was still telling myself it was a little bit darker than what I was originally imagining, but I think it's going to be okay. And the fact that, you know, with automotive paint, I'm very picky about the brand and the quality. I just can't see, especially living in the state of Texas where we deal with some serious heat and sunlight, I can't stand the thought of putting cheap paint on a car, not knowing whether the color's gonna fade or the clear coat's gonna peel. And I feel like the fact that you know, good paint like this is $1,400 a gallon these days, with everything being so expensive, that I would rather use this color that I have than, you know, have someone tell me, oh, you know, there's like, use this paint, it's cheap or whatever, it's cheap. It's really the last thing that I want on a car that I care about. It's just, I can't see putting a $200 or $300 color, you know, on a car that is just going to be so cool. And I just don't understand. Like, there's got to be a difference, you know, in the quality. Like, what are they not putting in it that, you know, that's making it so cheap compared to the Sherwin-Williams or the PPG top shelf paint system? So, I like the color. I think I'm going to go with it, and I'll get to use this Sherwin-Williams Ultra base coat that I've had sitting around for a little bit, and I think it's going to look great. So given the way that this trunk is kind of oddly shaped, it's got some things about it. You know, you can use the factory latch to hold it down, but I thought overall it would just be really cool to put an electric actuator on it, and then, you know, it almost kind of gives you that airplane spaceship feel. You hit the switch and you got something that's kind of moving on its own. I like it. So I figured I would try it out on the trunk, and here's a short clip of the way that I installed the actuator. There wasn't a whole lot to it, even though afterwards I did end up changing this bar a little bit so I could fit an air tank in that area, but for the most part, the way that I got it mounted is pretty much how it stayed, and it works out pretty well. Okay, so all it really took to get the actuator mounted, these aren't the best welds here either, pay no attention, was once I figured out about where I wanted it to go on the trunk lid, I mounted that piece temporarily with some kind of self-tapping or, roofing screws or whatever, just something that would hold it in there good. And then I had welded this bar from the V section of the roll cage, and it comes down, and then it was able to angle down to hit this V. So you can see about the way that goes. It's not a whole lot of extra. I also use those kind of self-tapping screws here, and they seem to work okay here for now. I might do bolts and nuts through this just to make it a little bit more permanent later. But that's all that it really took, and the bar works great. And I'm thinking this is actually a 200 millimeter stroke on this actuator, which I think comes out to somewhere around 8 inches. So even if I were to add a 10-inch stroke actuator, I think it would be pretty easy to mount it in that same spot on the trunk lid, but I might just have to adjust the position of this. Maybe it ends up mounting here a little bit further back, or I guess forward in reference to the car. So that's something I might do in the future, but that's all that it really took. Was I welded this bar in here, and it opens and closes with no problem. Of course, if you know me, I get a little bit excited, and I said it's been a few months since I've grabbed those wheels and put them on the car. Let's put the wheels on now that we got a few parts painted and just take a few pictures of the car out in the yard again. I just feel like I gotta see the wheels on the car every few months, and hopefully the next time, or maybe within the next 2 times, it'll be time to leave those wheels on. So here we go. It's definitely looking really cool, and I'm happy with everything so far. Well, you guys, that's going to do it for part 6 of this crazy build. Now, stay tuned. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should. Especially if you're building one of these cars, I'm going to share a lot of info with you. Now, as far as part 7 goes, I really think we're going to finally get into more detail of mounting the front clip and getting it to fit a little bit better. But after that, we're going to be getting down to the little trim pieces and kind of finishing things up. So it should start to get pretty exciting in the next couple weeks or months with this build. And hopefully we're seeing some light at the end of the tunnel. That being said, as I've mentioned before, I'm not trying to rush this car or rush this build. I like the way it's been going steady. I've even taken some time to completely revamp my garage, and I'm actually setting up a little paint mixing room. So hopefully by the next video I'm going to be able to show you around a little bit, and things are going to run a little bit more smoothly. as we get into painting this car and trying to finish it up. Thanks again for all the support. Always appreciate you guys out there, and remember, feel free to ask any questions that you might have if you're building a kit that you got from Vaydor. Melvin is always very helpful as well, so don't hesitate to reach out to any of us, and we'll be glad to try and help you along with this build. Cheers everybody, see you soon.